The Libyans in Egypt. The period of Libyan domination in Egypt, the 22nd dynasty, is said by Manetho to have lasted for 120 years. But the accepted chronology, wrote Sir Alan Gardner, finds himself compelled to legislate for fully 2 centuries. What is the basis for beginning the time of the Libyan dynasty of Egypt, that of Shoshanks and Azorkans? As early as 945 BC, or even earlier, and for stretching the period for over 200 years. The end of the period is well established, because, circa 712 BC, the Libyan rule was supplanted by the Ethiopian domination, and the latter stands firmly fixed in time in relation to biblical and Assyrian sources. The beginning of the Libyan dynasty was dated to 945 BC because a synchronical link was claimed to exist between the Bible references to Pharaoh Shishak. Okay, there's Shishak and Shoshank. I gotta get them 2 straight. Who conquered Palestine in the 5th year after Solomon. Hedjkeperi of the Libyan dynasty. The placing of Shoshank Hedjkeperi in the second half of the 10th century did not follow from the Egyptian material, but from the supposed synchronism of Rehoboam, who followed Solomon on the throne in Jerusalem. At Shoshank Hedjkeperi, in Ages and Chaos, I have pointed out this alleged synchronism is not supported by the available evidence, and I was able to show that the conqueror of Jerusalem and sacker of its temple was not a Libyan king, but Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. In the chapter entitled The Temple in Jerusalem, I compare Thutmose's depiction of the booty taken by him with the biblical description of the vessels and furnishings of Solomon's temple, to arrive at a positive identification of the sacker of Jerusalem's temple. Now to bring Shoshank Hedjkeperi to the head of the Libyan dynasty is unnecessary. Actually, he will be shown to belong to the end of the period of Libyan domination in Egypt, and to be the pharaoh of the scriptures. During the greater part of the 8th century, when the Libyan dynasty of Azorkans and Shoshanks ruled over Egypt, the kings of this country vied with the kings of Assyria for influence in Palestine and Phoenicia. Elibal, king of the Phoenician port city of Byblos, wonder if the Bible come from there, had an Egyptian artist carve a statue of Azorkan I and cut an inscription on its chest. Statue of Elibal, king of Gebel, Byblos made, since the conventional chronology made Azorkan a contemporary of Asa, who ruled over Israel in the early 9th century, before the present era. Elibal needed also to be placed in the 9th century, nearly 100 years too early, according to the conclusions reached in his work. Ababal, another king of Byblos, ordered a statue of Shoshank Hedjkeperi, that's a toughie, Hedjkeperi, to be carved and inscribed in his name. For this reason, Abibal was placed in the 10th century as a contemporary of that king. Placing Elibal and Abibal in the 10th and the early 9th centuries, respectively, created problems for epigraphists concerned with the history of the Hebrew script. The inscriptions on the sculptures are in Hebrew characters, and were the subject of much discussion in connection with the development of the Hebrew epigraphists. The epigraphists, who must take directives from the archaeologists, tried to reconcile the dates derived from these inscriptions with the characters on the stele of Mesha, the king of Moab, who in the middle of the 9th century revolted against Ahab, king of Israel, and with the ivories from Samaria belonging to the same period, and were rather puzzled. The inscriptions of Elibal and Abibal were written in a script that appears to bear closest resemblance to the 8th century Ostraka from Samaria. Yet the conventional historians have them precede the stele of Mesha. Evidently, the order of the Libyan kings on the throne of Egypt is not properly put together, and Elibal and Abibal belong to the 8th century, just as do Azorkan I and Shoshank Hedjkeperi, their contemporaries in Egypt. The 7 years which are attested on his genuine monuments The attribution of the stela was definitely clarified by Kaminos in an article published 2 years later, removing an error which has particularly affected the King's List and discussions of the Libyan period in Egypt. As a result of the two adjustments, the Libyan period becomes shorter by a total of 35 years. This did not, however, produce a lowering of the absolute date for the beginning of the dynasty, which is still held to be firmly tied to the supposed synchronism between Shoshenq, Hechpekari, and Rehoboam. But the shortening of the individual reigns within the dynasty is putting the entire scheme under increased strain. Did Thutmose III despoil the temple in Jerusalem? From now on, unless it's got a lot of writing like this on it, I'll probably just show the page. The commenter suggested that, and I like that. But if there's a lot of writing on it, it'll ferret out more information I think I should read. Sennacherib, the year 701 BC. The empire Sennacherib, son of Sargon, inherited was enormous. The god Ashur has entrusted in me an unrivaled kingship. From the upper sea of the setting sun to the lower sea of the rising sun, all mankind he has brought in submission at my feet. And mighty kings feared my warfare, leaving their abodes and fleeing. On climbing the throne, Sennacherib embarked on a series of campaigns, aimed at expanding it further still. He wrote of his marching troops, with the dust of their feet they covered the wide heavens, like a mighty storm with masses of dense clouds. And he boasted, the tents of the steppe I turned into a mass of flames. I swept like a hurricane. I besieged, I captured, I destroyed, I devastated. I burned with 2 campaigns against his enemies in the north, and still early in his reign, Sennacherib led his forces towards Syria and Palestine. The Assyrian army swept along the coast. It attacked Sidon and Uli. Its king fled into the sea and perished. Sennacherib appointed a new king and received tribute from him. Arvid and Ashdod and Ashdod, Ammon and Edom, Ammon and Edom brought him gifts and kissed his feet. Sennacherib encircled Beth Dagon, Jaffa, and Beni-Brak, and conquered them. The people of Ekron became afraid and called upon the Egyptian king, the bowmen, chariots, and horses of King Meluka, Ethiopia, a boundless host, and these came to their aid. The Assyrian army met them, Eltika, a small town on Palestine's Mediterranean coast. In the plain of Al-Tad Shuyu, their battle lines were drawn up against me, and they sharpened their weapons. Sennacherib fought with them and brought about their defeat. The Egyptian charioteers and princes, together with the charioteers of Ethiopian king, charioteers, my hands took alive in the midst with the charioteers of the Ethiopian king. My hands took alive in the midst of battle. The Egyptian-Ethiopian army was defeated at the walls of Eltika. Neighboring Ekron was stormed and its inhabitants killed. Their corpses hung on poles around the town. Lovely. As to Hezekiah the Judean, Hazachi El-Ua where you die, did not submit to my yoke. Sennacherib besieged the strong cities of Judah and the walled forts and countless small villages in their vicinity, and took them by assault, sending the surviving population into exile. 200,150 people, young and old, male and female. Then he turned against the capital. I made Hezekiah a prisoner in Jerusalem. his royal residence like a bird in a cage. Nevertheless, Jerusalem held out and Sennacherib withdrew, though not before exacting a heavy ransom. Hezekiah himself, whom the terror-inspiring philander of my lordship had overwhelmed, did send me later to Nineveh, my lordly city, together with 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, precious stones, couches inlaid with ivory elephant hides, and all kinds of valuable treasures, his own daughters, concubines, male and female musicians, in order to deliver the tribute and to do obeisance as a slave. He sent his personal messenger, having agreed to the ransom. Jerusalem was not entered by the Assyrian army. The corresponding biblical record in the second book of Kings, 18:14, differs only in the quantity of silver in the ransom. It too mentions 30 talents of gold, but only 300 talents of silver. Besides this record, on a clay prison, Assyrian bas-reliefs show the siege of Lachish in southern Palestine, on the way from Jerusalem to Egypt. From the biblical narrative, 2 Kings 18:14, we know that Sennacherib was at Lachish, pressing the siege. When he received Hezekiah's submission, Lachish must have fallen not long afterwards. The reliefs depict the fall of the city and a procession of its inhabitants being taken away to Assyria, some on donkeys, some on foot, carrying their meager possessions. Did Sennacherib press further south toward Egypt? In the extant inscriptions, Sennacherib did not mention a specific campaign in Egypt and Ethiopia. Since early times, the question has occupied the historians. Did Sennacherib subdue Egypt, or did he not? Herodotus wrote that Sennacherib came against the land of Egypt with a great host and encamped at Pelusium, near its northeastern frontier. Berosus, who wrote a history of Chaldea, said that Sennacherib conducted an expedition against all Asia and Egypt. Jewish tradition tells of the conquest of Egypt by Sennacherib and of his march towards Ethiopia. Sennacherib was forced to stop his campaign against Hezekiah for a short time, as he had to move hurriedly against Ethiopia. Having conquered this pearl of all countries, he returned to Judea. It appears that after the battle of Elika in southern Palestine, he was victorious over the Ethiopian-Egyptian army, and having broken the resistance of Hezekiah and reduced the fortified city of Lachish on the approaches of Egypt, Sennacherib crossed the border of Egypt proper, and at Pelusium received a declaration of submission.
The End of Samaria. When Samaria chose to give her allegiance to Egypt, Isaiah regarded it as a political mistake. Woe to the rebellious children that walk to go down into Egypt to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and to trust in the shadow of Egypt. For his princes were at Zoan, Tanis, and his ambassadors came to Hanes. 31, 2, and 4.
Zoan, Tanis.
Because of the tribute Shoshank received from Hoshea, king of Samaria, the 10 tribes of Israel were doomed to lose their homeland.
Shalmaneser
the fifth besieged Samaria, but Shoshank did not send any military expedition to relieve the siege of Samaria by the Assyrians. There is no mention of it in the books of Kings or Chronicles, nor the extant Egyptian documents. Isaiah warned, "Therefore shall the strength of Pharaoh be your shame, and the trust in the shadow of Egypt your confusion." By shadow of Egypt, I assume he means that Egypt was at this time a shadow of its former self. For the Egyptians shall help in vain, and to no purpose. Their strength is to sit still. 33 and 7. It was more than confusion. It was an end of national existence for the northern kingdom, or of Israel, the 10 tribes. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all land, and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. 2 Kings 17:5. For 3 long years Samaria withstood the siege. Nothing is known of what took place among the besieged, besides that they defended their capital, the last unconquered city. No word of any prophet among the besieged survived, as did the words of Jeremiah from the besieged Jerusalem less than 140 years later. This is how Sargon II described the conquest of Samaria. At the beginning of my royal rule, I, the town of Samaritans, I besieged, conquered, for the God who let me achieve this my triumph. I led away as prisoners 27,290 inhabitants of it, and equipped from among them soldiers to man 50 chariots of my royal corps. In earlier Assyrian conquests by Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V, the people of the land had already been carried into exile. Those removed by Sargon were the last of Israel. If we do not count those few who still in time went over to Judea, Hoshea was among those deported. The account of the 2nd book of Kings is, in the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Assyria, took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria, and placed them in Hala, and in harbor by the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Sargon, referring to another of his campaigns against Babylon, wrote, I bespattered his people with the venom of death. Of his campaign against Elam he wrote, into all their cities I cast gloom, and turned all their provinces into desert mountains. He did likewise to Israel and to Israel's land. Nice guy. The king of Assyria brought throngs of settlers from Babylon, Cutha, Hamath, Ava, and Sepharvim, and placed them in the city of Samaria. The town I rebuilt better than it was before, and settled therein peoples from countries of which I myself had conquered. Reign of Sargon II, 723 BC to 702 BC. The conqueror of Samaria and the Israelite tribes fell in the midst of a period of great natural upheavals. These upheavals, which marked the century between 776 BC and 687 BC, I showed in Worlds in Collision Part 2, Mars, to have been caused by perturbations in the celestial sphere, a battleground dominated in the sight of man on Earth by the planet Mars. The Earth was endangered at nearly regular intervals during this century by repeated near approaches of this planet. Pestilence also broke out in many places, and references in the cuneiform literature ascribe the case of it to Nergal, Mars. Earthquakes, overflooding, changes of climate, attested by Clemisterates, and the abandonment of lake dwellings in Central Europe, did not spare a single land. Calendars were repeatedly thrown out of order and refounded, and the reader will find abundant material in the second part of Worlds in Collision and Earth in Upheaval. I need to get that. Where no human testimony, but only the testimony of nature was presented, and my material could be multiplied by any dedicated researcher. These changes moved entire nations to migrations in the hope that beyond the horizon fertile lands not damaged by unchained forces of nature awaited the conquerors. It seems that in one of the earliest waves of the 8th century migrations, the Phrygians moved from Thrace over to Hellespont into Asia Minor. The tradition is that the first king in their new domicile was Gordias, and the story of his selecting the site for his capital, Gordian, is a well-known legend. Soon he came into conflict with the Assyrians, of course, who opposed the penetration of newcomers into Central Asia Minor, and Sargon II moved westward to stop the penetration of the Phrygians, by now ruled by Gordias, son of Midas. In the decades that followed, the Scythians descended from the steppes of Russia and moved along the Caspian Sea, the Caspian coast. The Scythians, at that time, worshipped Mars and a sword as his sign, for a while leaving their ancient worship of Saturn in abeyance. They were called Umanmanda, or people of Saturn. In the Akkadian, the so-called Hittite literary text, the Scythians in their migration displaced the nomadic Cimmerians, pushing them towards the south and west. The Assyrian defenses withstood the Cimmerian onslaught, but at a heavy cost, which included the death of Sargon in the battle in 702 BC. The Conquest of Ashdod. With Samaria's fall, the last stronghold of opposition to Assyria was extirpated. Not only did Egypt lose all of its remaining influence in Asia, its last Libyan rulers were themselves compelled to submit to Assyrian overlordship. By Sargon's 7th year, Pharaoh, the king of Masru, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is listed among those sending tribute to Assyria. Later in the same year, a certain Yemeni seized power in Ashdod, an independent principality next to Judah on the coast, trying to organize an anti-Assyrian league and enroll the help of Egypt. He, as Sargon recounts in his annals, sent bribes to Pharaoh, king Masru, a potentate incapable to save himself, and asked him to be an ally. The rebellious prince tried also to involve Judah.
Iowa, you die
in the conspiracy. But Hezekiah, probably at Isaiah's urging, refused to risk the nation's fate on so doubtful a venture. Informed of Yemeni's revolt, Sargon gathered chosen troops and sent them against the rebel. In a sudden rage, I marched quickly against Ashdod, his royal residence, without Egyptian help. The outcome was not long in doubt. The Assyrian king looted the rebellious city, along with other towns on the Palestine coast. Yemeni fled into the territory of Masru. Egypt belongs now to Ethiopia. The rebel king of Ashdod, however, did not find a safe haven with the Ethiopian king, the king of Ethiopia, who lives in a distant country and in an approachable region, whose fathers never, from remote days until now, had sent messengers to inquire after the health of my royal forefathers. He did hear, even that far away, of the might of Ashur. I assure you. Nebo and Marduk. There's a trio. The awe-inspiring glamour of my kingship blinded him, and terror overcame him. The Ethiopian king, anxious to conciliate powerful king of the north, extradited the rebel Yemeni. He threw him in fetters, shackles, and iron bands, and they brought him to Assyria. A long journey. No mention is made of Pharaoh, king of Masru, whose aid Yemeni had sought only a few months earlier, and it must be assumed that he had been disposed by the king of Ethiopia. This episode marks the first appearance of the Ethiopians in the Assyrian annals. The same events are described by Isaiah, a contemporary. The short 20th chapter of Isaiah opens with the verse, "In the year that Tartan came to Ashdod, when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent him and fought against Ashdod and took it." Isaiah continued and warned, "So shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian prisoners, and the Ethiopians captives young and old, naked and barefoot, even with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. And they shall be afraid and ashamed of Ethiopia, their expectation, and of Egypt, their glory." It is not spelled out whom the prophet had in mind by saying they. Israel had already been exiled in Sargon's first year. Isaiah apparently had in mind a party in Judea which saw rays of hope in the recent replacement of the Libyan masters of Egypt by an Ethiopian overlordship. Displaying a sense of statesmanship, Isaiah, in the manner of a dervish, walked unclothed and barefoot to emphasize the significance and possible consequences of an erroneous orientation. The quoted first verse of the 20th chapter of Isaiah contains the only mention of Sargon in the scriptures. Tartan, sent by Sargon to fight against Ashdod, is not a private name. It is a high military and administrative title. We have already read of the circumstances of the fall of Ashdod in the cuneiform inscriptions of Sargon. The Assyrian word Tartan refers to a high military
or administrative official, second in rank only to the king. Besides Tartanu, also Tartanu is attested. When they're talking about the deluge, the cataclysm, or the end of the world, or doomsday, it is important to cite David Talbott's work to get a glimpse of what all of these people were facing. And he's talking about the last cataclysm, or the deluge, when Mars approached the Earth. So I wanted to pay a little homage to Mr. David Talbott. I hope that he's doing well and wish him the very best, and wanted to say thank you. It enriched all of our lives. Here's a snippet of my favorite film, and if you get a chance, go check it out.
It is the golden age,
excellent.
The age of the great planetary conjunction. In the beginning there was the universal monarch, the firmly seated God, the motionless sun. A God remembered as the great sphere of heaven, when the heaven was close to the earth. The universal monarch possessed a luminous eye, heart, and soul, the mother goddess, Venus, daughter and spouse of the universal monarch. Within the womb of the goddess resided the unborn hero, Mars, heart of the heart, pupil of the eye. The goddess was the great star, radiating its comet-like hair in all directions, the celestial prototype of the beautiful princess. She was the glory of heaven, the animating flame giving life to the ancient sun god. Her place was squarely in the center of the sun. This produced the great wheel of the sun, with the goddess as the nave and the hero as the axle. As the configuration evolved, the comet-like streams gathered into three rays, remembered as the triform or threefold goddess. Later, this same comet-like material presented four streamers or rays, giving the wheel its four spokes, four luminous winds, four life-bearing streams, four flaming arrows launched into the four directions, and the four pillars of heaven. Day and night arrived with the coming of a great crescent on Saturn, this crescent enclosing the central star of Venus. He grew a beard. His tongue protruded. He took the form of a dagger or peg.
I wonder where I got the idea for my logo.
The hero consorted with the goddess, re-entering the goddess' womb as the impregnating seed, then emerging again in a new incarnation, as both the goddess and the hero broke away from their original axial positions. The reborn Mars wore a spiraling sidelock, which was the goddess herself, now taking on her serpentine aspect. Hero and goddess engaged in a spiraling dance about the cosmic center. The serpent tail wrapped itself around Venus to produce a band presenting the form of a great eye, so that in its re-entry, Mars became the pupil, or the red apple, of the eye. Saturn's golden age was interrupted by catastrophe, when the enclosure of the gods was sealed shut. The descent of the hero in his dark aspect brought overwhelming clouds and darkness. This was the underworld journey, the archetypal ordeal of the hero, and for the earth, a deluge of fire and water. The Golden Age gave way to the cosmic night, when the hordes of chaos were set loose and the doomsday dragon moved about in the sky, a monster created by the twisting forms of Venus and Mars. It was then that the terrible goddess appeared with wildly disheveled hair, lamenting the death of the universal monarch. In the events that follow, the hero will subdue the dragon or pacify the raging goddess. The universal monarch's own son, Jupiter, will be installed in the center of the sky. But the universal monarch has departed, and with his death comes the end of the Golden Age.
All that remain are fragments of a collective memory, and hidden deep in the human psyche, a sense of something irrevocably lost, and yet eternally yearned for. A paradise when heaven and earth were one. The death of this paradise was the birth of myth.